everyone. So I'm Alix Devendra. John just laid out a whole bunch of issues and challenges that we're facing. And I guess I'm here to help figure out how to solve them. I'm here to talk about how design thinking as a way of approaching problems might be used to help solve some of these issues. I'm just going to jump right into it. I'm just going to do a brief overview of what design thinking means, and then I'm hoping we can kind of have a discussion about what ideas this sparks. So what is design thinking, first of all? It's really simply a methodology. It's a formal, practical methodology. And people use it to help understand issues and develop creative solutions. It's not exclusive to designers. Anyone can use it. It's used in a lot of different business contexts, and I think it's definitely adaptable to the law as well. So there's a few different ways of formulating the design thinking process, but I think it's overall, most people would agree it can be summarized as a 5-step process. The first step is a discovery phase. That's really just about kind of getting the lay of the land, understanding what the heck's going on, kind of as John just did for us. And that's really necessary in order to be able to articulate what the issue is and what the challenge is that you're trying to solve. So that's kind of the second part of the process. You have to kind of define what it is you're doing. Then you get to do the brainstorming, which is, I think, where most people get excited to jump in. They want to start thinking about possible solutions and talking about what those might look like. And that's all well and good. And once you have a lot of great ideas generated, you can then start to kind of narrow them back down, pick a few that seem viable that you want to try out, and you take those into the prototyping and testing phases. And that's a really important part of the design thinking process because you want to get something tangible in your potential users' hands as quickly as possible so you can learn from them. You're not going to get everything right on the first go-round, so it's an iterative process. I actually envision it more as a circular process because when you develop a potential solution, you prototype it, you take it to your users for testing, you're really going to go back to that discovery phase and learn something new, something that these users didn't tell you about the problem the first time around, and now you're saying, oh, actually maybe an incubator is not going to work. Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's try something new. Or let's do another iteration of the incubator and see if we can improve it. And I think what John did a really great job of kind of laying out for you why the design thinking process is so important, because I think it is our natural tendency to want to jump right to brainstorming and prototyping. You have this idea, you think it's going to be great, but we haven't even stepped back and really agreed on what the issue is, and until you do that, you're just going to kind of be floundering. I did not say at the beginning that design thinking is a problem-solving method, and that was a little bit intentional. I try not to use that term because design thinking is really more solution-focused than problem-focused. It's about starting by articulating the goal and instead of focusing on the problem. So just to illustrate that point, if I told you that there was a man who was trying to cross this stream by stepping on the rocks, and he gets to this big rock, and then he can't go any farther because there's no more rocks to step on. And if I asked you to help me identify what the problem in the scenario is, we might say, well, he's run out of rocks to step on. And if we use that as our starting point, we might start generating potential solutions like, oh, well, maybe he can take rocks from the bank of the stream and drop them into the stream and then create more stepping stones for himself. But if we instead reframe it and ask ourselves, what is the man's goal? And the goal is to simply get to the other side of the stream, well, that opens up a whole new range of possible solutions. And by reframing our thinking, we might kind of be able to step back a little bit and realize, oh, there's a bridge right there that he could use instead. He doesn't have to walk across the rocks. So that's kind of to illustrate why we're trying to use these methods to change our thinking a little bit. So just to kind of dive into the 5 steps a little bit more, as I said, the first step is discovery. It's about getting the lay of the land. And with design thinking, it's all about being user-centered. You may have heard the term human-centered design. It's really about learning who the user is and designing for them. And you have to be able to empathize with them, understand the problem from their point of view. What do they see as their challenge? And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can go out and talk to people, interview people. You could send out a survey if you want to get a broader range of responses. You could even just do some observation, like go to the courthouse and sit there and see who walks in the door, and they don't even know which way to go, right? Like self-represented people, what are their issues in the courthouse? A really great example of why this is so important, there was a group of students in Stanford that were sent to Myanmar to do an irrigation project, and the whole point was to use design thinking. So they get there, they engage in the discovery phase, they meet with the local farmers, they talk about what are your issues around irrigation. Well, it turns out the farmers' biggest problem is that they don't have electricity, and so they don't have good lighting. They have to rely on kerosene lanterns, which are both dangerous and really expensive. So the students were able to kind of empathize with the farmers. They weren't wedded to the project they'd been assigned, which was to develop an irrigation system. They were wedded to helping these users. And so they completely changed the focus of their project. And instead of coming up with an irrigation system, they developed a cheap LED light source that could be used without electricity in the fields to help with crop irrigation. And that actually turned into a real business. They've sold millions of lights they're in 42 countries, I think. So it's really important to kind of start with the user, understand what their issues are. Sometimes it's not so easy to even know who the user is. And that's why it's important to kind of maybe talk to a broad range of stakeholders at the beginning, figure out who's involved in the process, what are the different ins and outs. John mentioned that our current system is designed for lawyers, but one of the statistics, I don't think you included it, John, but you told me over the phone, is that in Oregon family law cases, 80% of cases have at least one party that's self-represented. So self-represented litigants is a huge number of users, at least in that case type. So there's a lot of different people we can be talking about. And it's important to just get them out on the table so we know what we're going to do next. And that's kind of where the definitional phase comes in. And I really think it's important here, or it can be very useful, to be visual. So if you've done your discovery, you've kind of done interviews, you've done some research, you've gotten the statistics, gather that all together and start writing down your individual thoughts or insights on Post-it notes and try to get them up on a board. And by putting your thoughts out there visually, you'll be able to leverage your brain's ability to recognize patterns. The human brain is great at pattern recognition. So just getting your thoughts out there where you can see them will help you be able to start to notice clusters, and you can move the Post-its around and you can realize, okay, well, I've talked to all these different types of users, but really they're kind of falling into 3 buckets. Let me separate them out into thirds, or something like that. And as you kind of finish this definitional phase of both kind of defining who the user is and perhaps what part of the problem you want to focus on, because you can't solve everything, as I said, you want to pick a specific user that you're going to focus on for your brainstorming phase. And that's because we don't like to design for the average user. First of all, because there's no such thing, and then also because it leads to kind of flabby brainstorming. You're not going to think of the most unique creative solution if you're just trying to design for the average person. Instead, you want to design for extreme use cases, and this is what John touched on as well. So a really good example of this is the design firm IDEO was hired by the LA County office to redesign their voting experience and their voter booth. And they spent a lot of time working with potential users who were extreme use cases. So they worked with a large number of people with severe cerebral palsy, and they developed a touchscreen interface that worked for them despite their gross motor skills and fine motor skills being very limited. When they went to test that same interface with other types of users that didn't have those same limitations, the other users also found that interface easier to use. So by designing for the extreme case instead of the average case, you can come up with more creative solutions that end up working better for everyone, which was exactly John's point. So brainstorming, as I mentioned, I think that's naturally where people want to kind of go. They want to start generating ideas. And kind of what I love about design thinking is first it makes you kind of step back and do the discovery and definitional phases first, which leads to more successful brainstorming. And then also design thinking acknowledges and leverages two different types of thinking. There's what we call divergent thinking and convergent thinking. So with divergent thinking, it's all about going broad, about getting as many possible solutions out there that you can think of, and just it's about kind of expanding your mind. And on the flip side, convergent thinking is all about kind of limiting choices, starting to eliminate options that may not be the best, and focusing on which options are the best that I want to take forward to prototyping. And I think a lot of us have trouble with brainstorming because we can't turn off that convergent thinking. And so we're trying to generate solutions, but our analytical left brain is telling us, oh, well, that's not a good idea. Don't even put that one on the board. Someone's going to think that's too good. It's probably not going to work anyway. It's too expensive. So you just don't even get it out there. You don't even get to articulate it before you're criticizing yourself and eliminating it as a choice. But I think the nice thing about design thinking is that it forces you to acknowledge that there's two different ways of thinking, and it's okay. Brainstorming is the divergent thinking mode. You don't have to be critical. That's not the point. We're not evaluating the choices yet. We're simply generating them. Then, as you move into prototyping, you do engage in the convergent thinking. You do kind of evaluate the choices that have been put out there on different measures, whether how feasible they are, how expensive they are, and you select from there which ones you want to prototype. The nice thing too with one other thing I wanted to say about brainstorming is that it can be really helpful to embrace constraints. So not the self-critical constraints, but kind of the constraints from the outside world. Not only, I think if you choose an extreme user to focus on, there's already going to be some constraints built in that you're designing around, but you can also impose false constraints on your brainstorming just to help flex those creative muscles. So for example, you could ask yourself, well, let me see if I can generate 10 potential solutions that would only cost $100. Or let me see how many solutions I could generate that could be implemented by the end of this month. And those might not be actual constraints on your project, but it forces your mind to just go places it wouldn't have gone otherwise, and you'll generate more ideas, which is the whole point. And then from there, you do take forward a few ideas into the prototyping phase. A prototype is simply taking an idea and making it tangible. So, people think of it with like physical objects that an engineer might design, but you can prototype a process. You can sketch it out. You can do a storyboard about how you think a process would unfold at the courthouse. You could even do a skit to show what your idea is and how it would unfold between two people. And the whole point is just to make it more than just you saying your idea, because by building, it's a way of refining and articulating our thoughts. So you might realize that the idea that sounded really great during brainstorming is actually way more complicated when you start to put pen to paper and try to explain how it would actually work. The other benefit of prototyping is it gives you something to take back to your potential users for testing. So testing is all about getting user feedback. It's not about selling or defending your idea. It's about putting it out there and seeing how people react to it. And again, that's why it's so important to have something that you can just hand over and say, hey, I came up with this idea. This is what I was thinking. What do you think? And
And that allows them to just kind of react to it. You can see them interacting with it. Maybe they don't even understand what you're talking about, or they're not approaching it the way you thought they would. And that's great. That's just more feedback for you to take back to the drawing board for your next iteration, or scrapping it and starting over completely. And again, one of the benefits here with prototyping and testing is that by getting this out there early for feedback, if it's a total failure, that's okay. In fact, that's the point, because if you invest a ton of time and money into something before you show it to anyone, you're going to be so wedded to it that you're not going to be willing to accept critical feedback. So instead, you want to put it out there while it's rough and barely sketched out, and start working with potential users at that point so you can refine it and build it from there. So that's basically all I did formally in terms of slides. I'm a lawyer by training, but I now consult for lawyers and legal tech companies on graphic design, visual design, and design thinking. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. There's obviously a lot more to unpack than what I just went over. But I think John wanted to reserve time so we can open it up for discussion.